the valley did not warn you. That was the first thing a man learned in Bitterroot. The weather, the winters, the things that undid you arrived without announcement and left you standing in the wreckage, trying to remember what you had believed an hour before. A horse that had broken 4 men stood alone in the far corner of a corral, scarred eye angled away from the world that had made it that way. A wagon came through the gate, 1 bag, 1 woman, and she did not look at the house. She looked at the horse. Somewhere in the valley, a man who had spent 18 months building walls around everything he trusted stood at a fence he would not leave for the rest of the afternoon, holding a cup that had gone cold hours ago, watching something he had already decided was impossible. He had been wrong before. He was about to find out exactly how wrong. Calhoun Reed had not slept past 4 in the morning since Josephine died. That was a fact about him now, the way the bad knee was a fact. The way the scar along his left forearm from a fence wire in '79 was a fact. Things that simply were without requiring explanation or apology. He stood at the corral fence in the gray before sunrise with a tin cup going cold in his hand and watched iron. The horse stood at the far corner of the enclosure the way it always stood, alone. Weight shifted back on its haunches. The scarred eye angled slightly away from the house, as though it had made a private decision, some time ago, about which direction was worth watching and which was not. The scar itself was the thing people noticed first. A pale seam running diagonally across the right eye, the skin around it hairless and smooth in a way that read, at a distance, like a brand. Nobody had put it there deliberately. The previous owner, a drifting horse trader named Pickens who had come through Iron Creek 2 summers back, and who had unloaded the animal at a price that should have told Calhoun everything, had explained it as a fence accident. Calhoun had nodded and handed over the money. That was the kind of man he had been, once. A man who nodded and handed over money. 4 hands had tried to break iron in 2 years. Not bad men, not careless men. 3 of them were the best working cowboys in Bitterroot Valley, which was a valley that had produced better than its share of working cowboys over the decades. Men who had grown up on horseback and who understood difficult animals, the way other men understood difficult terrain, by feel and by instinct and by the accumulated knowledge of having been wrong before and survived it. The 4th man, Calhoun had hired specifically because someone in town said he had a gift. The gift had lasted 11 minutes before iron put him against the fence rail hard enough to crack 2 ribs. Calhoun had paid the doctor's bill. He had not apologized, because he had warned the man, and the man had said he understood the risk, and Calhoun had learned in 51 years that you could not protect people from their own confidence. You could only pay the bill afterward. He had told Amos Pruitt after that there would be no more attempts. Amos had said nothing, which was Amos's way of saying he thought Calhoun was right, without making Calhoun feel good about it. The horse had stood in that corral for 2 years now, costing feed and water, and the low persistent awareness of a problem without a solution, and Calhoun had come to think of it in the mornings, the way he thought about the 2 sections of east pasture fence that needed replacing, or the roof over the grain storage that had been patched 3 times and needed replacing outright. A thing he knew was wrong, that he had not yet found the right way to fix, that he looked at every morning without pleasure. The difference was that the fence and the roof did not look back. The morning came in over the ridge, the way September mornings came in over Bitterroot, slow and golden and cooler than it had any right to be after the summer they had just put in. Calhoun turned the cold coffee onto the ground and set the cup on the fence post and thought about Josephine. Not deliberately. He never did it deliberately anymore. She arrived in pieces, the way she always arrived now, a fragment of a Tuesday morning 3 years ago, her voice saying something he could no longer precisely reconstruct from across the kitchen, the shape of her hand against the curtain when she was watching rain. Grief at his age was not the drowning thing people described, the thing that swept over you and took your footing. It was more like weather you had learned to read. You knew when it was coming. You knew roughly what it would feel like. You stood in it and then it moved on, and you were still standing. The morning he had written the advertisement, he had not been thinking about Josephine. He had been thinking about the books. Not the accounts, exactly, though the accounts were their own particular weight. The house books, the ledger of a household that ran without anyone at its center, meals that were functional rather than meals. Rooms that were clean because Amos's wife came in twice a week, not because anyone lived in them with intention. He had sat at the desk in the room that had been Josephine's room before it became just a room with her things still in it. And he had looked at the wall for a while, and then he had written the advertisement. Amos had found it on the desk the next morning, and read it without being invited to, which was a liberty Amos took regularly, and which Calhoun permitted, because Amos was usually right about which liberties mattered and which did not. Amos had set the paper back down and said that a woman from a working ranch background would know what she was walking into. Calhoun had said he was not looking for someone to walk into anything. He was looking for someone practical. Amos had said those were not different things and had gone out to the barn. The letter from Tennessee had come 6 weeks later. Calhoun had read it 3 times, not because it was long or complicated. It was neither, but because of a habit he had developed, against his own nature, in the 18 months since Warren Finch. He read everything twice to find what was not there, and then he read it a 3rd time, to check whether what he had decided was not there was actually absent, or whether he had simply failed to look in the right place. Warren Finch had been a land speculator out of Helena, who had come to Bitterroot Valley in the spring of '79, with a map that looked precise, and a manner that looked honest, and a proposal for jointly purchasing grazing rights on a section of territory that bordered Calhoun's north pasture. The proposal had made sense. Warren Finch had made sense. Calhoun had written the check in April, and by July had understood that the grazing rights were encumbered by a prior lien that Finch had known about and not disclosed, and by August he had understood that Finch had known Calhoun would not discover this until after the ink was dry, and by September Calhoun had accepted, with the specific interior silence of a man who has been shown something about himself he did not previously know, that he had been the kind of man who wanted to believe a thing was good, and had therefore believed it. He was not that kind of man anymore. The letter from Tennessee said Mabel Holt, 32 years old, raised on a working horse ranch in the eastern part of the state, experienced with livestock and ranch work, accustomed to long seasons and physical labor. The handwriting was even and unhurried, which told him something, though he was cautious about what he let himself read into handwriting. No embellishments, no phrases that reached for more than they were carrying. He had written back. He had written the kind of letter a practical man writes in response to a practical inquiry. The size of the operation, what the work would require, what he could offer in terms of the arrangement. He had not tried to make it sound like more than it was. He did not know whether Mabel Holt had tried to make herself sound like more than she was, because he had no way to test it until she arrived, and the only honest thing to do was to wait and see and not decide in advance. He had decided in advance anyway, not harshly. He had not formed any specific negative opinion of Mabel Holt on the basis of her letter. He had simply arrived, over the months between her letter and this morning, at a quiet private expectation that the distance between what someone described about themselves in a letter and what they actually were in front of you was almost always considerable, and that the safest position was to know this in advance rather than discover it afterward. Warren Finch had not taught him this. He had learned it from Warren Finch, which was a different thing. The lesson did not belong to the man who taught it. The lesson belonged to the one who paid for it. The wagon from Iron Creek came into earshot at 7:15, the creak and roll of it carrying on the still morning air before it was visible at the head of the track. Calhoun heard it and stayed where he was at the corral fence, not because he was being deliberately unwelcoming, but because moving towards something before it arrived was a habit he had lost somewhere in the last few years and not particularly mourned. Amos came around from the direction of the barn and stood to Calhoun's left and also said nothing, which was the correct response to a situation that had not yet declared itself. The wagon came through the gate and stopped in the yard. The woman who climbed down from it did so without waiting for the driver to help, which Calhoun noticed. She had a single bag, a dark leather traveling case that she set on the ground beside her before she did anything else, and what she did next was look around, not at the house, not at Calhoun, at the corral. She stood in the yard of a ranch she had never visited, having traveled from Tennessee by train, and then by hired wagon on a rough track through early September dust, and her eyes went straight to the far corner of the corral, where iron stood in its habitual solitude, and she went still for a moment in the particular way of someone who has seen something they recognize and are thinking about what they recognize. Then she looked at Calhoun. Up close, she was neither what he had expected nor what he had feared, which was perhaps the most honest way to describe her. The traveling clothes were good but not new, which suggested she had dressed to arrive, not to impress. The hair was dark and pulled back with the efficiency of someone who worked outdoors regularly. The eyes, when they landed on him, were a shade between gray and green, and they had in them the quality of eyes that have seen enough of a particular thing that they are no longer startled by it, whatever the particular thing was. The black horse in the far corner. Her voice was level and carried a Tennessee flatness to it that was not quite what he had expected. What happened to it? Calhoun told her what he told anyone who asked, keeping it short, the way you kept short a story that did not have a good ending. Bought 2 years ago, cannot be broken. 4 men tried, none succeeded. She looked back at Iron for a moment after he finished. Iron had not moved. The scarred eye was still angled away, but both ears had shifted, and Calhoun had learned enough about horses over 51 years to know that when the ears moved, the animal was processing something. Then Mabel Holt looked at him again and asked whether he would object to her trying. The question sat in the morning air between them with the particular weight of something that needed to be evaluated before anyone responded. Calhoun looked at her, at the traveling case on the ground beside her, at the dress she had traveled in, at the fact of her which was in all external particulars not what a man thought of when he thought of the kind of person who could do what 4 of his best paid hands had failed at. And he felt something that was not quite amusement and was not quite pity, something in between those, the feeling of a man who can already see the end of a situation and is being politely asked to pretend he cannot. "Can you break a wild horse, Mrs. Reed?" He heard himself say it and corrected before she could. "Holt, my apologies." The slip was its own small embarrassment. "Mrs. Holt, you have until sundown. I will even wager the price of that dress on it, though I expect to have my money back before noon." She looked at him for a moment without changing her expression. "Noted," she said, and picked up her traveling case, and asked where she should put her things. That was it. No protest, no negotiation, no asking what he meant by the remark about noon. He had half expected the second and had expected the third, and had prepared a mild backtrack in case she took the wager as offensive. She had taken it as information and moved on, and Calhoun watched her cross the yard toward the house and felt the very specific discomfort of a man whose calculation has not been contradicted and has also not been confirmed. Amos said, beside him, without inflection. "Huh." Calhoun said nothing. Amos said, "I'll have someone show her the room." Calhoun said that would be fine and turned back to the corral, where Iron had not moved, but where both ears were now pointed toward the direction the woman had gone. He did not think about what that meant. He thought about what needed to happen before midday. Mabel Holt came back out 40 minutes later. She had changed out of the traveling dress into work clothes, a plain skirt cut shorter than fashion required, and a dark blouse that had been washed enough times to have lost whatever color it had started with. And she was carrying the traveling case she had arrived with, except that she had it in one hand, not carrying it the way you carried something you intended to put down somewhere permanent, carrying it the way you carried something you intended to use. She walked straight to the corral gate. She did not ask Calhoun for permission. She did not ask Amos for the gate. She opened it herself with the easy economy of someone who had opened 100 corral gates, stepped inside, and set the traveling case down on the ground, just inside the gate where the horse could, from the far end of the corral, see it. Then she stood still. Calhoun was at the fence before he decided to be at the fence. He had told himself he had work to get to, and he did have work, and the work was not going to do itself. But he was at the fence with his arms crossed watching anyway, because he had spent 2 years watching 4 capable men fail at this problem. And whatever this woman was about to do, he had not seen it before. She was doing nothing. She was standing 5 feet inside the gate, with her hands at her sides, and she was doing nothing at all. Not approaching the horse, not speaking, not moving, just standing in the early morning light in the center of an unsuccessful situation and breathing. Iron tracked her with the good eye. The scarred side was still angled away, which Calhoun had observed was the horse's default, presenting the damaged side to the fence rather than to the open space. The ears moved back and forward, the assessment of an animal taking inventory of a new development in its environment, without having yet decided what category the development belonged to. Calhoun watched this for 20 minutes before he said anything. He said it over the fence rail, not unkindly, with what he intended as a practical observation about the situation. Mrs. Holt, the horse needs to be broken, not watched. She did not turn to face him. She answered in the same level tone she had used in the yard, directed toward the middle distance of the corral. 4 men rushed it, Mr. Reed, and iron through every one of them. I am not in a hurry to become the 5th. If you would like to shorten the wager, I will not hold you to Sundown. The use of the horse's name. He had not told her the horse's name in the yard. He had said the black horse. She had either heard it from Amos in the house, or she had asked the driver, or she had simply listened better than Calhoun had been paying attention to. He did not know which, and the not knowing was a small specific irritation. He said nothing further. Amos had come back from whatever task had taken him to the barn, and was standing at the rail 3 feet to Calhoun's right. Amos watched the corral with his hands in his jacket pockets and his hat brim level, the stance of a man who had decided to take his time about having an opinion. 30 minutes in, Iron stopped pacing the fence line. The horse had been moving in its habitual circuit, the slow back and forth of an animal that did not like confined spaces, and had been expressing that dislike for 2 years in the only way available to it, and then it stopped. Not because anything had happened, because nothing had happened. It stopped in the middle of its circuit, with all 4 feet planted, and its head up, and it looked at Mabel Holt, the way it had previously looked at the 4 men who had tried to approach it, which was with absolute concentrated attention, and then it did something Calhoun had not seen it do in 2 years of watching it. It lowered its head, not completely, not the way a horse lowered its head when it was relaxed, but the neck came down 6 inches from where it had been, and the ears, which had been high and working, settled into something closer to neutral, and Amos said, quietly enough that the words were more for himself than for Calhoun, that horses' ears haven't been at neutral since I've worked this property. Calhoun heard it and did not respond, because the correct response required him to acknowledge that Amos was right, and he was not yet certain he wanted to acknowledge that. What he was certain of was that he was still at the fence. He had been at this fence for the better part of an hour, which was longer than he stood at any fence on this property that was not costing him money right now, and the honest accounting of the situation was that this was costing him money, had been costing him money for 2 years, just not in a way that showed up in the ledger as a number. He thought about Josephine again, involuntarily, the way he always did when something happened that he could not immediately categorize. Josephine had had the capacity to walk into a room where a complicated thing was happening and understand the shape of it faster than Calhoun could construct a framework for thinking about it. He had never been entirely sure whether this was intuition or whether she simply paid attention to different things than he did, and he had never asked because the question had always seemed, in the moment of forming it, like an admission of something he was not ready to admit. He had spent a lot of time not asking questions he should have asked. He understood this now with the clarity that came from having run out of chances to ask them. Inside the corral, Mabel Holt was moving, not toward Iron. She was walking slowly in a wide arc that kept her well outside the distance that had provoked reaction from the horse in previous encounters, moving along the perimeter fence rather than cutting through the space. She moved the way water moved around an obstacle rather than through it, choosing a path that required the horse to track her with its attention but did not require it to make any decision about whether she was a threat. Iron tracked her, both ears now actively rotating to follow her position as she moved, not the pinback ears of an animal preparing to act, not the forward-locked ears of something startled, something else, the posture of an animal that had classified a new object and was continuing to gather information about it before deciding which category it ultimately belonged to. Jack Devereaux arrived sometime around mid-morning. Calhoun heard the horse before he saw the rider, and he knew the approach by the pace of it, the particular unhurried lope of someone who had not set out to arrive at any specific time. Jack Devereaux was 26 years old and worked for the Ennison outfit 2 miles north, and he had been present on the afternoon 2 years ago when the second man tried to saddle Iron. and the horse had put him against the fence post hard enough to spring a shoulder joint. Jack had helped carry the man to the wagon. He had been, in the months afterward, the most vocal of the various people in the valley who held that iron was simply an animal that could not be brought to working purpose, and that the most sensible resolution was to sell it on or put it down. He rode up to the fence and looked into the corral without greeting Calhoun immediately, the way you looked at something surprising before you said hello to the person standing next to it. "I heard in town this morning," he said. He had the manner of someone who intended to see this through before he believed any part of it. "I need to watch the rest of it before I have a view." Calhoun told him to suit himself. Jack pulled his horse alongside the rail and stayed in the saddle, watching Mabel Holt in the corral with the expression of a man who expected to see something he could explain. What was happening inside the corral at that point was not easy to explain. Mabel had, in the 2 hours since entering the gate, reduced the distance between herself and iron by perhaps 30 feet. She had done it in increments small enough that no single movement had triggered the horse's withdrawal instinct. And she had done it without anything resembling the direct frontal approach that had preceded every one of the 4 previous failures. She had moved sideways as often as she moved forward. She had stopped when the horse's posture shifted and stayed stopped until it resettled. She had turned her back to the horse twice, not completely, not in a way that would read as a display of dominance or submission, just in the casual way of someone present in the same space and not particularly focused on its contents. Iron had not bolted. Iron had not charged. Iron had stood in the middle of the corral and watched us with both ears in neutral, and the scarred eye angled away and the good eye tracking every increment of her movement through the space. "The horse has been that close to the fence line twice this morning," Amos said, to no one specifically. He meant that iron had been moving toward the fence rather than away from Mabel, which was the opposite of the behavior it had shown in every previous encounter. "First time both ears have been tracking someone without the back and forth." Jack said nothing. He was watching. Calhoun was watching. What Calhoun was watching was not entirely the horse. He was watching the woman in the corral. He was watching the woman in the corral and trying to construct a framework for what she was doing. And the framework kept failing because what she appeared to be doing was simply being present, not performing presence, not demonstrating patience as a technique, simply standing in the same space as an animal that had spent 2 years deciding that humans represented a specific category of experience and waiting, with what appeared to be genuine indifference to the outcome, for that animal to revise its conclusion, he thought, without wanting to, about Warren Finch. Not because the situations were similar, they were not, but because of what came before Warren Finch, the version of himself that had existed before the lesson. That man had been, Calhoun understood in retrospect, somewhat careless about evidence. He had been willing to build significant structures on small foundations because the building felt good, because forward motion felt better than stillness. Warren Finch had simply found the crack in that architecture and applied pressure to it. The correction, as Calhoun had applied it to himself in the years since, had been to require more evidence before committing to any conclusion, more proof, presented directly, before trust was extended. What he had not examined until this morning, standing at his own fence in his own valley, was the question of whether the correction had been calibrated correctly, whether he had adjusted the aperture so far in one direction that things it should have let through were now being excluded. He had decided, reading Mabel Holt's letter, that her description of herself was likely generous. He had decided this before she arrived. He had decided it because Warren Finch had taught him to decide it, and because the lesson of Warren Finch was real and cost him considerably, and he was not wrong to have learned it. But he had applied it to a letter from a woman in Tennessee who had not done anything to earn his suspicion, and he had applied it before she had been given a single morning to be whatever she actually was. He had not examined this until now because the conclusion had arrived before the evidence, and conclusions that arrive before evidence are comfortable in a way that makes them difficult to dislodge. Inside the corral, Mabel Holt took 3 slow steps forward and stopped. Iron stood its ground. The horse's nostrils were working, reading the air between itself and this person who had spent 3 hours doing nothing alarming. And after a moment that lasted long enough for Calhoun to become aware that he had stopped breathing, Iron took 1 step toward her, then stopped. then took another. The second step was smaller than the first, more deliberate, the movement of an animal that was overriding some older instruction with a newer one, and was being careful about the override. The scarred eye was toward her now, not angled away. The scar caught the mid-morning light and showed its pale seam clearly. The record of something that had gone wrong before this horse arrived in Bitterroot Valley, something that had happened to it in some other yard, on some other morning, that Calhoun knew nothing about and could not undo. Iron stopped 6 feet from her. Mabel Holt extended her right hand, palm down, fingers relaxed. She did not reach toward the horse. She simply let the hand be there at the end of her arm in the space between them. Iron dropped its head and smelled her fingers. Jack Devereaux said something that was not quite a full word. A sound that a person makes when they see a thing that their previous framework does not accommodate, Amos said, and his voice had in it something that was not quite dry and not quite emotional. Somewhere between them, Mr. Reed, I believe you may lose that wager. Calhoun did not respond. He was looking at his new wife standing in the morning light of his corral, with her hand extended, and a horse that had put 4 good men on the ground pressing its nose, very gently, against her palm. The touch lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Mabel withdrew her hand without hurry, and Iron raised its head and watched her with both ears forward and the scarred eye open. And Calhoun felt a discomfort that did not have a clean name. It sat alongside admiration in a way that was uncomfortable specifically because of how much the admiration had to displace in order to be there. He thought, I told Amos this morning she would have her money back before noon, he thought. I decided that before she stepped down from the wagon, he thought. I have been standing at this fence for 3 hours watching a woman do something I told myself she could not do, and I have not moved, and I will not move, because somewhere in the second hour I stopped watching to confirm a conclusion, and started watching because I could not look away. The morning continued. The sun moved its arc over the valley floor. Amos went to find something to occupy himself and came back. Jack Devereaux did not leave. A rider from the Coulter place came along the road, saw the gathering at the fence, and stopped without being invited. Inside the corral, the distance between Mabel Holt and Iron continued to close in increments too small to mark individually and too significant to ignore in aggregate. Calhoun Reed stood at the fence of his own property, in the valley he had worked for 23 years, on the morning of his second marriage, and understood something that he had been in the process of not understanding for 18 months. He had applied a lesson in the right direction and the wrong proportion. He had been burned by a man who spoke well and delivered nothing, and he had decided the lesson was to doubt what people said about themselves until they proved otherwise, and this was not wrong exactly. But he had extended it to cover things it did not originally cover. He had extended it to cover a letter from Tennessee, and then he had extended it to cover a woman who had not yet had an hour in his yard, and he had done this because doubt had become, without his noticing, not a tool he picked up when needed but a posture he maintained constantly. And Mabel Holt had not argued with the posture. She had not addressed it. She had walked past it and gotten into a corral with a horse that had broken bones for 2 years, and she was proceeding, with a patience that appeared to cost her nothing, to demonstrate what she had written in a letter he had read 3 times looking for exaggeration. He turned the empty tin cup in his hands. He had been holding it since 7 in the morning. He thought about Josephine saying he listened but did not hear, in a kitchen 3 years ago, and thought about not asking what she meant by the distinction, and thought about how the moment for that question had passed so completely that it now existed only as a specific and permanent regret. He was 51 years old. He had built something real in this valley, something that had required genuine work and genuine judgment and 23 years of getting up before the sun. None of that was undone by this morning, but this morning had shown him the edge of a thing he had not seen the edge of before, or had seen and had not let himself name. He had doubted the wrong claim entirely. He had looked for the exaggeration and missed it, not because it was not there, Josephine's husband Warren Finch lessons notwithstanding, but because there had been no exaggeration to find. The letter from Tennessee had been, if anything, understated, and he had read it with the tools designed to find excess, and found exactly what he had been equipped to find, nothing, which he had interpreted as suspicious in itself. Inside the corral, Mabel reached into the bag she had brought and set something on the ground. Calhoun could not see what it was from the fence. She had set it down beside her feet and stepped back from it, giving Iron the space to move toward it if Iron chose to. The horse looked at the object, looked at Mabel, looked at the object, then moved toward it. Amos, at the fence, said nothing. But he settled his weight against the rail in the way he settled in when he intended to remain somewhere for a while. Jack Devereaux, who had arrived expecting to see the thing fail, was still on his horse at the fence, and he had gone very quiet in the way of a man who has been loud about an opinion, and is now watching the opinion be taken apart in front of him. Calhoun watched Iron smell whatever Mabel had set on the ground, watched the horse investigate it without alarm, watched a woman 32 years old, who had traveled from Tennessee with one bag, do something in 3 hours that 4 capable men had failed to do in 2 years. And he thought, with a clarity that would not have been possible before this morning, whatever I owe her, it is considerably more than the price of that dress. He did not say it yet. He would say something before the day was done, because he was not the kind of man who withheld acknowledgement when acknowledgement was clearly owed. But the right moment had not arrived, and he had learned, if he had learned nothing else, from 23 years in this valley, that the right moment was worth waiting for. He stayed at the fence. The morning turned toward afternoon. Iron stood in the center of the corral with its head no longer angled away, the scarred eye forward and the good eye forward, and both ears tracking the quiet movements of the woman who had been patient enough to let it decide. The afternoon came in harder than the morning. The way September afternoons in Bitterroot Valley had a habit of arriving with more intention than they announced. The light shifted from the soft gray gold of early hours into something sharper and more direct, the kind of light that showed the dust on everything and made shadows lean eastward, with a definiteness that reminded anyone paying attention that the day had a fixed end coming, whether or not the business of it was finished. Mabel Holt had been inside that corral for 4 hours. Calhoun had stopped counting at 3 and started counting again somewhere in the 4th without deciding to. The way you tracked something without admitting you were tracking it. He had left the fence twice. Once to speak with Amos about the water situation in the South Trough, which genuinely needed addressing, and once because he had told himself he had stood at that fence long enough, and a man his age should have better use of a Tuesday. Both times he had been back within 10 minutes. Not because anything dramatic had happened, because he kept needing to know what was happening next, which was a feeling he had not had about anything in this valley for longer than he could precisely locate. Jack Devereaux had not left at all. He had tied his horse to the fence post at some point and moved from the saddle to the rail itself, sitting up on the top board with his boots hooked over the second one below, the position of someone who had made peace with being somewhere for the duration. He had said very little since the moment Iron had touched Mabel's palm, and the silence had a different quality than the silence he'd arrived with. He had arrived skeptical in the loud way, the way of a man whose skepticism is a posture he maintains in company. The silence he was in now was the silence of someone doing genuine revision. The riding hands from the Coulter place were still there, 2 of them now, the first having apparently sent word back to the outfit about what was worth riding over to see. The woman from the Coulter household had come with the second man, which was notable, because she had not been to the Reed property in the 2 years Calhoun could account for, and her presence meant the information had spread past the bunkhouses and into the kitchens, which in Bitterroot Valley meant it had become the kind of thing that would be discussed at tables from one end of the creek to the other before sundown. Calhoun was not certain how he felt about that. He had lived in this valley long enough to know that half of everything that happened here happened in front of witnesses before it happened in any other way, and that the witnesses were not incidental to the event, but were in some specific sense part of it. The valley confirmed things by watching them. He understood this intellectually and had never been entirely comfortable with it in practice. Amos had come back to the fence and resumed his position to Calhoun's left with the ease of someone returning to a seat they had reserved. He watched the corral with the focused quietness of a man who was processing something in real time and intended to finish processing it before he formed a final position. Inside, Mabel was now working in the horse's immediate space, not on the horse, not yet, but within reach, which was a distance that had been, for 2 years, an impossibility. She was moving her hands in slow, deliberate paths through the air near Iron's neck and shoulder, the kind of motion that looked, from the fence, almost like nothing, like a woman passing her hand through the air because she felt like it, but which Calhoun had been watching long enough to understand, was a kind of conversation conducted without language. She was mapping the animal's edges, finding where attention sharpened and where it softened, moving through the places it could tolerate and retreating from the places it could not, without crowding any boundary hard enough to require a response. Iron's tail was still. That was the thing that kept pulling Calhoun's attention. The horse had not been still-tailed in human company since it arrived on this property. The tail was the first indicator, always, the first signal that something was about to escalate, and it had been the signal, in all 4 previous encounters, before anything else had gone wrong, the flag before the storm. The tail was still. The horse stood with its weight distributed evenly, not gathered back and tensed for departure, and the ears moved attentively without locking in the forward-pinned way that preceded the lunge. Amos said it without being asked, the way he said things that were simply true, and therefore needed saying. In 11 years on this property, I have not seen that horse stand evenly weighted with a person inside arm's reach. Calhoun said that was a significant observation, which it was, and which was also the most he was prepared to concede at the moment. Amos did not press it. From inside the corral, Mabel's voice came over the fence line, not directed at Calhoun specifically but carrying to where he stood, in the way that voices carry when they are not being kept private. He was never wild, Mr. Reed. He was frightened. And frightened things become dangerous when frightened people keep trying to force them past their fear instead of walking them through it. The sentence sat in the air over the fence rail with the quality of something that had been said about more than one subject simultaneously. Calhoun felt it as you feel something that is accurate, with the specific discomfort of accuracy applied to a place that had been, until the moment of contact, numb. He thought, she is describing the horse. He thought, she is describing exactly the horse, and also the situation between the two of us since 7 this morning, and she knows it. And she has said it in front of Amos and Jack Devereaux and the people from Coulter's, and she has done it without changing her tone 1 degree. He said nothing for a moment. Then 4 men tried force. None of them thought to try patience. Her response came without pause, still in the level Tennessee voice, and she was facing the horse when she said it, not him, which gave it the quality of being offered rather than aimed. Patience is slower, and it doesn't look like doing anything, which bothers men who need the work to be visible. I have found that is true with horses and with most other difficult things equally. Jack Devereaux, up on the fence rail, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite a cough. Amos remained expressionless, which on Amos's face communicated quite a lot. Calhoun looked at his wife, standing calmly in a corral, with an animal that had fractured confidence and 1 bone apiece across 4 men and 2 years, and thought about the specific sentence he had composed in his head that morning when the wagon came through the gate. The sentence about how the distance between what someone described about themselves in a letter and what they actually were in front of you was almost always considerable. He had composed it carefully. He had been proud of it, in the private way of a man who believes he has made himself proof against something that hurt him once. He had been wrong about the letter. He had been wrong before the wagon cleared the gate. The traveling case Mabel had set down inside the corral earlier was still there by the fence, and now she moved to it without alarming the horse, the movement slow and sideways, keeping her profile to Iron rather than her back. She reached into the case and produced something small, and Calhoun had to lean forward slightly on the fence to see what it was. A halter, soft braided leather, no metal hardware of any kind, the kind of thing a person made rather than bought, or bought from someone who made things correctly. She held it at her side and did not attempt to move with it immediately. She set it down on the ground the same way she had set the case, close enough that the horse could investigate it on its own terms, at a distance that required the animal to choose to engage, rather than having the engagement delivered to it. Iron looked at the halter on the ground. The horse looked at Mabel, looked back at the halter. Amos said it very quietly, so quietly that Calhoun was not certain Jack Devereaux at the fence heard it. 2 years, and she's got him looking at the halter on his own. Calhoun did not answer, because the answer was yes, and yes was not a sufficient response to what he was seeing. The crowd at the fence had grown to something like 15 people. More had arrived in the last hour. The way arrivals compounded in the valley, when something was happening, each person drawn by the one before them, a chain of curiosity following curiosity. There were 3 women among them now, which made the event something different than what it had been at mid-morning. When only ranch hands attended something in this valley, it was a working event. When women came, it became something that would exist as a story, something that would be shaped by the telling and retold until its edges were smooth. The woman from Coulter's was named Margaret, and Calhoun knew her well enough to know that she was attentive, in the way of someone who processed the world by watching it rather than by moving through it, and she was watching Mabel with the specific attention of one woman watching another do something for the first time she has been told, in various ways, she should not be able to do. Jack Devereaux cleared his throat and said something that was half to himself and half to the fence rail. I told 3 people this morning this was going to end the way the other 4 times ended. A pause. I am going to have to find those 3 people. Nobody laughed exactly, but the air shifted the way air shifts when something has punctured a tension without removing it. Mabel had begun moving the halter, not onto the horse, not attempting placement, simply moving it through the air in the area near Iron's head, so that the motion of the thing, and the smell of it close, became familiar rather than sudden. The horse watched. The horse tracked. The horse did not move away, which was extraordinary, and which Calhoun understood more fully the longer he stood watching it. Iron had spent 2 years defining a zone around its own head and neck that no human hand or piece of equipment had successfully entered. Mabel had been at the fence 3 hours ago. She was now within that zone, and the zone had moved to accommodate her. He thought about Warren Finch again, not because he wanted to, and not because the comparison was flattering. Warren Finch had moved into his confidence the same way, incrementally, never asking for more than seemed reasonable in the moment, each step appearing justified by what came before it, until the whole architecture of trust had been built, and then the floor opened beneath it. He had applied that experience to Mabel Holt's letter as a template for how trust was broken, and he had done this without accounting for the possibility that the template described the method of a specific dishonest man rather than the nature of trust itself. What Mabel was doing in the corral was the opposite of Warren Finch. She was earning access by providing something real at each interval. The horse's calm was the proof. You could not fake a horse's calm with better language or a sharper-looking map. The horse was calm because she had done something that produced calm, and she had done it because she knew how, and she knew how because the letter from Tennessee had, if anything, understated the case. He had doubted the wrong thing. He had doubted skill because skill had been claimed. What he should have doubted was the absence of proof, not the claim itself, and the proof was now walking in slow circles in the center of his corral with its ears at ease. The halter went on without ceremony. That was the only way Calhoun could later describe it to himself, the lack of ceremony being itself the thing, the fact that there was no dramatic moment, no lunge or resistance, or the sudden physical scramble that had preceded every previous attempt. One moment the halter was in Mabel's hands, and she was moving with it slowly through the space near the horse's head, and then through a series of small adjustments that happened so gradually that no individual movement triggered the alarm that would have sent Iron to the other side of the corral. The halter was on. Margaret from Coulter's made a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was the sound a person makes when something they have been holding in releases, a breath that had been accumulated over the last hour and was now allowed to leave. Several people made the same sound almost simultaneously, the fence rail audible for a moment with the collective release of something like withheld amazement. Jack Devereaux gripped the fence post with one hand and said, voice low and direct and addressed to no one and everyone simultaneously, I was at this fence when the second man went down. I saw that. And now I am at this fence seeing this. Both things happened. I am going to need some time with the fact that both things happened at the same place. Amos said, take whatever time you need, Jack. Calhoun watched Mabel stand with one hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. The halter settled softly around Iron's head, the horse breathing with the long, easy rhythm of an animal that has arrived somewhere. It did not expect to arrive, and does not yet know what to do with the fact of having arrived there. The scarred eye was toward the fence now, toward Calhoun. And there was something in the angle of the horse's head, in the way the neck had dropped and the shoulders had settled, that was different from anything Calhoun had seen from this animal in 2 years of watching it, he thought. I told her she had until sundown. I believed when I said it, that sundown was more time than she would need to fail. He thought she was never racing the sundown. Mabel brought the horse to the fence line on the lead rope, taking her time with it, not rushing the walk. When she was close enough to speak without raising her voice, she stopped and looked at Calhoun with an expression that was not triumphant. It would have been easier, in some ways, if there had been triumph in it. Triumph was a response Calhoun had a ready framework for. What was in her expression was simpler and harder to address. The quiet steadiness of someone who had done a thing they knew they could do, and had simply done it, and who was not surprised by the outcome, only patient about when it arrived. He was waiting for someone to ask instead of tell. Her voice carried the same level quality it had carried all day. Every one of those 4 men came in here with a conclusion about what this horse was going to do, and proceeded to make it happen. I came in here without a conclusion. Calhoun looked at her for a moment. He said, and meant it in more directions than the one it was pointing, I came to the fence this morning with a conclusion about what this afternoon was going to look like. She held the eye contact without filling the pause for him. He said, I was wrong. I knew it by the 3rd hour, and my pride kept the accounting closed for another hour and a half after that. Amos, at the fence, turned slightly away in the manner of a man who had heard something that confirmed what he suspected and found it more affecting than he had expected to, and was not going to let anyone see that. Mabel said, You will have time to settle the accounting, Mr. Reed. I intend to have him following me without the lead entirely, before the light goes. The apology can grow accordingly. There was something in it that might have been dry humor, or might have been simply the kindness, the Tennessee directness that had characterized everything she said since stepping down from the wagon that morning, and Calhoun found that he could not with certainty tell the difference, which meant he could not formulate a quick response, which meant she had already turned back to the horse before he had produced one. He stayed at the fence. This was noted by Amos, who noted things without annotating them. Amos had worked for Calhoun for 11 years, and in 11 years had never once seen him stand at a fence this long over anything that was not producing an immediate and measurable cost. The afternoon deepened. The crowd at the fence did not thin. More arrivals came. A few of them people Calhoun recognized from the far end of the valley, which meant the information had traveled further and faster than the valley's usual pace, which was already faster than most people from outside it expected. A man named Potts from the outfit near the northern boundary arrived on a lathered horse, which meant he had ridden with some urgency once he heard, and he looked into the corral with the expression of a man who had hurried to see something he was not certain he would believe. He believed it in about 90 seconds. Mabel had progressed from the halter to the lead rope, and Iron was walking with her in slow, wide circles around the corral, not beside her exactly. Not in the disciplined position of a trained animal that had been taught to heel, but in the proximity of an animal that had made a choice. The distinction was visible if you knew what to look for. A horse walking on command moved with the posture of obligation. Iron was walking with something closer to election, choosing the radius, occasionally moving a half step wider, and then drawing back to the preferred position, navigating the space according to its own judgment with Mabel as the reference point rather than the authority. Calhoun knew what to look for, and he was looking. Mabel paused near the fence where the crowd was thickest and did not address anyone specifically, but her voice carried to the rail with no effort. The thing a frightened animal cannot tolerate is being forced to move faster than its understanding. Push it past what it has processed and you get the version of it that everyone sees. Give it time to process and you get the version underneath. Margaret from Coulter said to no one and to everyone, She is not talking about the horse. Nobody disagreed. Calhoun turned the thought over. He had been the version everyone saw. He had been operating from the surface layer of himself, the one Warren Finch had installed by breaking something in the deeper layer, and he had shown that surface version to Mabel Holt since 7 that morning, and she had not addressed it directly, had not argued with it, had simply proceeded to demonstrate, in front of 15 people and a horse, and 11 years' worth of his foreman's quiet observation. What was underneath it? He thought about the version of himself before the lesson. The man who had taken Warren Finch's map at face value. He had been too open then, which was a real flaw and one that cost him, and he understood why the correction had been necessary. But a correction applied without limits was not a correction. It was a new distortion in the opposite direction. He had known Mabel Holt for one day, and he had spent the first 3 hours of it accumulating evidence against a conclusion he had already reached. The honest accounting. Calhoun understood now in the way you understand something when the alternative to understanding it has been removed, was that he had been looking at the wrong problem. The problem was not whether Mabel Holt had overstated herself in a letter. The problem was that he had decided she had before she stepped off the wagon. The light was beginning to angle in a way that told him there were perhaps 2 hours before sundown. Inside the corral, Mabel brought the lead rope to a stop and stood with iron at her shoulder, both of them facing the fence. She reached into the pocket of her work skirt and produced something small, a piece of dried apple by the look of it. The kind of thing you put in a pocket because you plan to need it, not because you happen to have it, and she let Iron take it from her open palm with the relaxed ease of a transaction between two parties who had established the terms. Jack Devereaux watched this from the rail and said, not asking anyone, "She brought that in her pocket this morning." Amos confirmed it. "She brought the halter too. In the bag she set inside the gate." Jack let that sit for a moment and then said, "She planned the whole of it before she got in there." Amos said, "It appears so. She knew she could do it. She knew she could do it." The distinction between knowing you can do something and being able to do it was, Calhoun thought, exactly the thing he had failed to account for. He had treated Mabel's confidence in her own capacity as the suspicious element, the thing to be verified against reality before being accepted. What he had not accounted for was that some people knew what they were capable of, because they had done it, not because they wished they had, and that knowledge of that kind was not bragging. It was information. He said it aloud before he had decided to, directed at the fence post as much as anyone. "I have spent 18 months treating confidence as a warning sign." Amos said nothing for 3 seconds. Then Warren Finch was a confident man. He was. So is every man who knows what he's doing. Calhoun did not answer that, because there was no answer to give that was not simply an agreement to that particular statement required him to look at a considerable stretch of the last year and a half and assess it differently than he had been assessing it. He did that now, standing at his own fence, with the afternoon light leaning toward evening and his wife in the corral below him, and a horse that had never been easy being easy. It was not comfortable, but comfort was not the point. The lead rope came off. He saw Mabel remove it and knew what was coming. Because the logic of the afternoon had been building toward this, each hour a step in a progression that had its own internal necessity. And what came next was the one thing that could not be managed or assisted. It required the horse to make a free choice, and the horse's choice was going to be what it was, and no technique or patience would change it once the rope was removed, because the rope was the last instrument, and without it the only thing in the corral was what had been built between them across the hours. Mabel walked to the center of the corral. She stopped. She stood with her back to the fence, facing the far end where Iron had retreated slightly when the rope came away, and she stood still the way she had stood still at the gate that morning, with the complete quality of stillness that required either great practice or a disposition toward it that other people spent their whole lives trying to approximate. The crowd went quiet. Not quiet the way people go quiet when they are being polite. Quiet the way people go quiet when they understand that whatever happens next cannot be improved by anything they do, and that the best available contribution is to not disturb it. Iron stood at the far fence. The horse looked at the corral, at the gate, at the open space in between, and at the woman standing in the middle of it. The choice was visible. The way choices are sometimes visible from the outside, when the person making them is an animal, and the options are clear. Stay where it was, go to the gate, go to the woman. Calhoun held the empty tin cup. He was aware of it, only because his hands needed to be doing something. And they had latched onto the nearest available object. And the nearest available object was the cup he had brought out that morning, and had not put down since. Iron moved. Not quickly. One step, then another, then a third, each placed with the deliberation of an animal that was choosing each one individually rather than moving in a continuous flow. Because the continuous flow required trust, it was still deciding whether to extend. The scar caught the late afternoon light on the third step and showed its pale geometry clearly, the record of some older morning that had gone wrong. And then the horse was across the corral and standing at Mabel Holt's shoulder, exactly where it had walked all afternoon on the lead rope, except that the rope was lying in the dirt 30 feet behind them, and there was nothing between the horse and the gate and the open evening. The fence broke, not literally, the crowd broke, which was the sound of 15 people releasing something they had been holding for 2 hours, a sound that was not quite a cheer and was not quite a gasp, something between the sound of a collective that has witnessed a thing it did not have full confidence it would witness and now had to absorb the fact that it had. Jack Devereaux said it to no one, or to the fence post, or to the principal of the thing. I rode over here at 6 this morning expecting to see a new wife embarrass herself in front of half the valley. A pause long enough to be intentional. I am going to be telling this afternoon to anyone who will sit still long enough for the next 20 years. Calhoun Reed stood at the fence of his own property, in the valley he had spent 23 years building something real in, and watched his wife walk the horse in one slow final circle, unled, the animal choosing the circumference and the pace, and felt the chords of something in his chest draw tight in a way that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with its opposite, and did not yet have the word for it, but would. Mabel brought Ian back to the gate and stopped there, and the horse stopped with her, and she looked at Calhoun across the fence rail with the first real expression of warmth he had seen from her since the wagon arrived, not the professional steadiness she had maintained all day. Something underneath that, something that was hers, rather than the version of her that had been working? I believe that settles the wager, Mr. Reed. Not triumphant, just true, though I was never racing the Sundown. I was only ever waiting for him to decide I was worth trusting. The same as I imagine I have been waiting for you to make that same decision since I stepped off that wagon this morning. The sentence landed in the space between them, with the weight of something that had been true all day and was only now being said aloud, and Calhoun felt it the way you feel something when you have been moving around it for hours, and someone names it directly, and suddenly there is nowhere left to stand that is not inside the truth of it. He looked at his wife, at the horse standing at her shoulder with its ears forward and its eyes easy and its scar catching the last of the afternoon light. He looked at the gathered crowd, at Amos and Jack and Margaret and Potts and all the rest of them who had come to see something and had stayed to see something larger than what they came for, he said, and meant every degree of it. I decided somewhere in the third hour, Mrs. Reed. I knew by then. My pride took another hour and a half to catch up with what I knew, and the debt I owe you has been compounding the whole while. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked at Iron, who had turned its head slightly, the scarred side now presented to the fence rail, the good eye watching Mabel with the specific quality of attention that an animal gives to a thing it has decided to trust. She ran her hand along the neck one time unhurried, and the horse did not move. Amos, beside Calhoun, said nothing. He was looking at the middle distance, past the corral, in the manner of a man who had reached a conclusion he found affecting, and had elected not to share it with anyone present. Jack Devereaux climbed down from the fence rail and stood in the dirt and said, looking at Mabel, and then at the horse, and then at no particular point in the middle air between them, I owe 3 men an accounting of what I told them this morning, and I owe you something, Mrs. Reed, though I don't know yet what the right shape of it is. I know I stopped believing that horse was possible to reach about 1.5 years ago. I stopped believing it out loud, in public, more than once. He paused. I was wrong out loud and in public, and I believe in being wrong the same way I was wrong, so I am saying it here. Mabel looked at him with the same direct steadiness she had applied to everything else in the day. You stayed to watch, Mr. Devereaux. That's a different thing than a man who would have ridden home after the first hour. He took that in the way of a man receiving something he had not expected to receive, and was not entirely sure what to do with. The crowd had begun the slow dispersal that crowds make when the thing they came to see has finished, but finished in the way that a thing finishes when it is not the end of anything but only the end of one chapter of something larger. People moved away from the fence in groups of 2 and 3, talking in the low voice of people processing what they have seen and what it meant, and how it would be described to the people who were not there. Margaret from Coulter's paused at the gate and looked back one more time at the corral, at Mabel and the horse still standing in the late amber of the evening, and then walked on. Potts, who had ridden hard to be there, looked as though the ride had been worth it. He said so to Amos on the way out. Amos said he suspected most rides were if you arrived at the right time. Calhoun did not leave the fence until Mabel brought Iron through the gate and handed the lead rope to the hand who had appeared to take the horse to the barn for the night. And even then he moved slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who has been standing somewhere important, and knows that moving away from it is not a small act. He walked with her back toward the house in the last minutes of daylight, side by side in the way of two people who have not yet established the distance that is natural between them but are working toward it. The house ahead of them was lit in the windows, Amos's wife having come in at some point to put the lamps on, and it looked, in the way that houses sometimes look from a distance at the end of a long day, like a house that might have someone in it. He said it without preparation. The way honest things get said. I spent 18 months learning to doubt first. I applied it to your letter before you arrived. I applied it again the moment you asked about the horse. There was no evidence to support it, only a lesson I had overcorrected from. And I want you to know that I know the difference between the lesson that was right and what I made of it. Mabel walked 2 more steps before she answered. I know the shape of that kind of doubt, Mr. Reed. I had a man tell me once that the thing I was best at was the thing that least suited me. It takes a particular kind of confidence to unhear something like that once it has been said. I did not come to Montana to prove anything to anyone who said it, but I did come here with something to prove. He looked at her, and she looked straight ahead at the lit windows. I wanted a place where the thing I know how to do was wanted rather than tolerated. That is what I came for. Whatever else this arrangement is or becomes, that much is what I need it to be. He thought about the east pasture, the north fence, the 2 sections of the property that had been running at half efficiency for 2 seasons, because he could not be in 2 places, and had not had reliable judgment in a second pair of hands. He thought about the innocent colt that had arrived last spring, and that 3 men had declared unworkable, and that he had eventually sent back at a loss, because he had no one to put it with who knew what they were doing. He thought about what it would mean to have someone who knew what they were doing. That is what this will be, he said, and meant it as a commitment, which was the only way he made them. I intend to spend considerable time making good on the rest of the accounting. They reached the porch steps. The evening was coming in cool from the ridge, the particular September coolness that promised frost before the month was out. Mabel stopped at the bottom step and looked back toward the barn, toward the direction Iron had been taken, with an expression that was not concern exactly, but the trailing attention of someone who has spent all day in relationship with a thing and does not fully close the account, just because the day has ended. Then she went up the steps and into the house. Calhoun stayed on the porch for a moment in the way he had a habit of staying on porches, looking at the valley in the dark that was coming in over the ridge, and the fence lines, dissolving into it, and the distant lights of the Ennison place to the north, and the particular quality of stillness that Bitterroot Valley had at the end of its days, the stillness of something large that has set down its work and is breathing. He thought, I told her before noon. He thought I was wrong before noon. He thought, there is a difference between the man who was wrong and refuses to look at it, and the man who looks at it directly and corrects the position. And that difference is the only real accounting that matters in a life of 51 years. He went inside. The house was different, with lamps in the windows and someone who had set them there. The first real test did not announce itself. That was the thing about tests that mattered, they never did. 6 weeks after the afternoon of the corral, a horse trader named Briggs came through Iron Creek with 4 animals he was moving south before the first hard freeze. Calhoun rode into town on a Tuesday, looked the horses over, made his assessment, and bought 2 of them, a roan and a gray. He paid Briggs, arranged the transport, and rode back to the property with the particular satisfaction of a man who has made a clean decision and executed it cleanly. He told Mabel at supper, not because he was hiding anything, because it had not occurred to him to do otherwise. 23 years of making every decision on this property alone had built a groove so deep that the thought of consulting someone before acting did not present itself as an option to be selected or rejected. It simply did not present itself. Mabel set her fork down, not with force, with the deliberateness of someone buying a moment to arrange what they actually want to say rather than what arrives first. She said, "Which two?" He described the roan first, the confirmation, the gait, the way the animal had stood under his inspection without agitation. Then the gray's clean lines, the price he had gotten which was fair, the projection for what both animals could contribute to the working rotation by spring. She was quiet for long enough that the quiet became something he was aware of. She said, "The gray. Was its left eye tracking when you approached from that side?" He thought about it. He had approached the gray from the right, then from the front. He had not specifically noted the left approach, because the animal had been cooperative throughout the inspection, and there had been no signal that warranted additional attention. He said, "I did not check it specifically." She said, "I would have liked to look at it before you decided." The sentence was precise and did not contain anything that was not true, which was what made it land the way it did, not an accusation, an accurate statement of a preference that had not been consulted. Calhoun sat with it and felt the specific discomfort of a man who has done something reasonable by the standard he has always applied, and discovered that the standard has changed without his fully internalizing the change. He said, "I have been buying horses for this property for 23 years. She said, "I know." He said, "I did not think to ask." She said, "I know that too." The difference between those two sentences and the conversation they opened was the thing that kept Calhoun awake that night. In a way he had not been kept awake since the early weeks after Josephine, not with grief. With the particular wakefulness of a man who has encountered the edge of his own habit and is looking at it clearly for the first time. He had stood at that fence 6 weeks ago and watched his doubt be dismantled hour by hour. And he had told himself and Mabel both that he understood what that afternoon meant. And he had understood it, in the corral, in the specific context of the horse and the wager and the watching. What he had not understood, because understanding a principle in one context and carrying it into all the other contexts of your life were different things requiring different work, was that the afternoon in the corral was not the conclusion of something. It was the first lesson in a longer education. The gray arrived 2 days later with the roan. Mabel walked out to the temporary pen without being asked and looked at both animals for 20 minutes. With the same unhurried inventory she applied to everything. She approached the gray from the left on the third circuit. The horse shied hard, not dangerously, but definitively, the sideways scramble of an animal reacting to something in the left field of vision that it did not process as neutral. She stood back and let it resettle, and then looked at Calhoun, who was at the fence. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The gray had said it. He said, "Tell me what you see," she said. Something happened to that eye before Briggs had it. Could be vision loss, could be light sensitivity from an old injury, could be something it was trained into by someone who always worked it from the right and let the left side stay unaddressed. Any of those takes time to work through. More time than the roan will take. He said, "Is it workable?" She said, "Most things are workable. The question is what you are trading for the work." He said, "I paid good money for it." She said, "I know. That is not the question I asked." He stood at the fence and looked at the gray, which had settled again, and was now investigating the fence post with the idle curiosity of an animal that had moved past its reaction and filed it under the category of things it would need to revisit when provoked again. He thought about the roan, which had stood steady throughout Mabel's inspection, weight even, ears neutral, the easy attentiveness of an animal without a hidden complication. He said, "If I had asked you before I bought it," she said, "you would have bought the roan, and probably one of the other two Briggs had." He said, "Which one?" She said, "The bay on the end, the one you likely looked at and moved past, because it was less immediately impressive than the gray." He had looked at the bay. She was right that he had moved past it. The gray had the better surface presentation, the cleaner line, the kind of confirmation that rewarded a quick assessment. The bay had required more time to read, and he had not given it the time because the gray had already satisfied his criteria. He said, "I should have brought you." She said, "Yes," he said. "I am telling you that plainly, not as a concession. As a fact I should have understood 6 weeks ago." She looked at him for a moment. with the expression he was still learning to read, the one that lived under the professional steadiness, the one that was hers rather than the version of her that was managing a situation. She said, "I did not expect you to unlearn 23 years in 6 weeks. I only needed to know whether the unlearning was actually happening," he said, and she said, "It is happening. It is just happening at the pace that honest things happen, which is slower than people prefer and faster than they usually admit." He sent word to Briggs the next morning about the bay. Briggs had already moved on south but had not yet sold it. The negotiation took 3 days by letter and cost Calhoun a moderate additional sum that he did not resent spending. Because the cost was not the purchase price of a horse. The cost was the tuition on a lesson about the difference between the decision he was capable of making alone and the decision he was capable of making with the right person alongside him. The bay arrived in October and was in regular working rotation by the following spring. The gray took the better part of a year and Mabel's specific, patient attention before it could be worked reliably from both sides. She addressed it the same way she had addressed iron, in increments, without rushing the process past what the animal could integrate, and Calhoun watched her do it across the autumn and winter months, with the same quality of attention he had brought to the corral fence in September. He was learning to watch differently, not for the outcome, for the method, because the method was the thing that transferred. October became November, and November settled into the particular silence of a bitterroot winter establishing itself. The working radius of the property contracted the way it always contracted in the cold months, the daily movement becoming the movement of maintenance rather than expansion, the work turning inward. Calhoun had known this rhythm for over 2 decades and moved through it by instinct. Mabel moved through it differently, with a kind of focused attention to the smaller details of the season that he had not brought to it in the years he had managed it alone, the water situation in the barn, the specific feed requirements of the animals that would be working hardest through the cold, the inventory of what would be needed before the next supply run became difficult. She was not managing, she was inhabiting. And the difference between those two modes was something he was only now, watching her, fully able to articulate. He had been managing for 3 years, since Josephine. The ranch had run because management was what he had defaulted to, when the thing underneath management, the actual living presence in the work, had been removed. You could run a property on management. You could keep the accounts in order, and the fence lines reasonable, and the herd numbers within acceptable range. What you could not do on management alone was the thing he watched Mabel do on a cold November morning when she stood in the barn doorway looking at the horses in their stalls with the expression of someone listening to something too quiet for other ears. He asked what she was looking at. She said, listening. The gray favors that left front in the cold. Not enough to show in the way it moves, but enough that I can hear it in the rhythm when it shifts weight. He stood beside her and listened. He could not hear what she was hearing. He was honest about this. She said, "You will eventually. It takes time to train the ear for the specific animal. You have to know what its normal sounds like before you can hear when the normal shifts." He said, "How long did it take you?" She said, "For horses generally, years. For each specific horse, it depends on how much time you have spent in proximity to it without an agenda." He thought about this for a long time after she went back inside. Without an agenda. He had spent 23 years approaching every animal on this property, with an agenda, the agenda of the work it needed to do, the purpose it was meant to serve in the running of the ranch. It was not wrong to have the agenda. The ranch required it, but the agenda had been the whole of his approach. And what Mabel was describing was something that existed alongside the agenda, rather than in place of it, the kind of attention that gathered information the agenda would never think to ask for. The winter was long, and the property held together better than it had in the 3 previous winters. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be visible to anyone outside the daily operation, but in the specific small ways that accumulated into the difference between a season that cost you something unexpected and a season that cost you only what you had planned for. Calhoun noted this without attributing it loudly. Mabel noted it without mentioning it at all. February came in hard and white, the kind of February that made the valley floor feel like the bottom of something, the ridges above pressing down with the weight of their snow. The work became the work of keeping things alive, the daily round of it, and Calhoun and Mabel moved through it in the parallel rhythm they had established across the months since September, each knowing what the other was doing, without requiring the coordination to be spoken. It was a Thursday evening in the second week of February. The supper things had been cleared, and Calhoun was at the desk with the account books, and Mabel was at the table with the seed and supply notes for the spring, the two of them in the same room, doing separate work in the comfortable silence of people who had stopped needing the silence to be filled. She said, "The house will need different arrangements by autumn." He looked up. She was looking at her notes, not at him, with the directness of someone delivering information they have decided should be delivered plainly rather than constructed around. The full weight of what she had said took a moment to arrive, the way the meaning of a sentence sometimes lags behind the hearing of it. When it arrived completely, and he sat with it in the way he sat with things that required sitting with, not avoiding the full dimension of them, but not rushing through them either. He said, "How long have you known?" She said, 6 weeks. He said, "You waited 6 weeks to tell me." She looked up from the notes then. She said, "I needed to know first. There is a period before you know that knowing is reliable. I did not want to tell you something that turned out not to be true." He looked at her across the table, at the woman who had arrived in September with one bag and had, in the months since, become so threaded through the fabric of how this property and his days inside it functioned that he could not now reconstruct what the daily texture of the place had been without her, could not remember it as more than a general shape, the way you could not remember the specific quality of a room before it had furniture in it. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The autumn, that gives us time." She said, "That is what I calculated." He said, "I will rebuild the east room. It has been storage. It should not be storage." She looked at him with the expression he had been learning to read since September, the one that lived underneath the steadiness, and said, "That would be more than adequate." He said, "It will be more than adequate. I want to be precise about that. I have been imprecise about a number of things since September, and I am working against the habit. But this particular thing I want to be precise about from the start." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window the February dark was complete, and the cold was audible in the way. Cold was audible on the property, in the deep of winter, the small contractions of wood and metal yielding to temperature. She said, "I did not come to Montana expecting this." He said, "No." She said, "I came expecting a place where the thing I know how to do would be wanted rather than tolerated. That was what I needed. Everything else has been additional." He said, "Is the additional acceptable?" She said, "The additional is considerable." A pause, not the pause of someone searching for words, but the pause of someone letting the words land at the right speed. I find I was not accounting for the full extent of what considerable would feel like. He said, "Neither was I. The account books stayed where they were. The seed notes stayed where they were. Would you treat them with kindness?" The two of them sat across the table in the February silence, and the lamp between them threw its circle of light onto the surface of the things they had been working on, and the things they had been working on were no longer what the room contained. He thought about the morning of September, the wagon coming through the gate, the cold cup in his hand, the decision he had already made before she stepped down. He thought about the 6 weeks between that morning and the evening the gray horse arrived with its complicated left eye, and what those 6 weeks had cost both of them, not in dramatic terms, not in the terms of rupture or recrimination, but in the quieter cost of assumption running ahead of reality. He had been closing the distance on that assumption across the whole winter, in the account of the horses and the fence's decisions, and the 100 small moments of asking before deciding, and the asking had not diminished anything. It had enlarged everything, he said. "I want to tell you something I have not said directly." She waited. He said, "The afternoon in the corral. I understood what it showed me about the horse and about my own judgment regarding your letter. That understanding was real. What I did not understand until the gray arrived was that understanding something in one context does not carry itself automatically into every other context. I had to learn the same lesson again with the horses at Briggs. I expect I will have to learn versions of it in other places I have not yet arrived at. I am telling you this because I think you deserve to know that the man you are in this arrangement is not a man who has arrived at something. He is a man who has started." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I know what kind of man I am in this arrangement with." "I knew it by the end of the first week," he said. "What did you know?" she said. I knew you were the kind of man whose doubt, once it was honestly broken, did not reassemble itself in the same shape. That is not a common thing. Most men whose doubt gets broken either build it back faster or abandon it entirely and replace it with something worse. You have been doing the harder version, which is carrying it differently. He did not have an immediate response to that, because it was accurate in a way that required a moment to absorb the kind of accuracy that was not flattering exactly, but was something more useful than flattery. He said, You observed all of that in the first week, she said. I observe things. It is what I do. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows and the dark was the deep dark of February in the valley, and inside the lamp held its circle, and the circle was sufficient. He started on the east room in March, when the freeze had softened enough to work the ground around the foundation and the wood could be moved without cracking in the cold. He did not hire it out. He had hired out the last significant addition to the property, the barn extension in '77, and had overseen the work with the detached efficiency of someone managing a project. This was different. He did not analyze why it was different. He simply found himself at the east wall with his tools before the day's other work began, in the particular early morning, quiet of the property before the hands were moving, and he stayed there until the light required him elsewhere. Mabel came out on the third morning and stood in the open space of what the room was going to be, and looked at the dimensions, the framing that had begun to suggest a shape. She said, The south wall, is that where the window is going? He said, The south wall gets the morning light. I wanted the morning light in there. She stood in the unfinished space and said nothing for a moment. He continued working. The sound of the tools was the sound of the work, and the work was the most concrete language available to him for what he was trying to say, which was something about permanence, about the difference between a man who managed a life from a careful distance and a man who was willing to build a room with his hands for what was coming into it. She said, You have been out here before the hands every morning this week. He said, The light is better in the early morning. She said, Calhoun. He looked at her. She said, I see what you are doing. He said, I am building a room. She said, You are building a room the way you have done everything since September that you decided actually mattered. Slowly, without telling anyone the full reason, making it right rather than making it fast. He considered that. He said, Is that a criticism? She said, It is an observation. I observe things. The flatness in her voice had something underneath it that had been appearing more frequently across the winter, something that was warmth without being soft, the particular warmth of a person who has decided someone is worth the full attention. I find I do not object to it. He went back to work. She stayed in the unfinished room for another few minutes, her hand flat against the framing of the south wall where the window would go, feeling the structure of it, and then she went back inside. He heard the kitchen door close behind her. He worked until the hands needed him, and then put the tools down and went to the day's other requirements and came back to the room in the last light of the afternoon, until the light was not sufficient and then stopped. He did this for 6 weeks, the room taking shape around the fact of what it was being built for, which was not a project he was managing but a life he was inhabiting. Amos found him at the south wall on an April morning, fitting the window frame. Amos looked at the work for a moment with the quality of attention he brought to things that were being done correctly, which was the same quality he brought to things that were being done incorrectly, indistinguishable from the outside until he spoke. He said, Window faces south. Calhoun said, Morning light. Amos said, Good thinking. He looked at the room, at the walls, at the floor. Calhoun had laid himself over the previous 2 weekends. He said, You did the floor yourself. Calhoun said yes. Amos said, You have not done finish work yourself since the kitchen in '74. Calhoun said no. Amos was quiet for a moment. Then, It is good work. He said it the way he said things that were true and mattered, without addition, and then he went to whatever he had come to do and did not bring it up again. The observations sat in the room the way Amos's observations sat, with the weight of something that had been said by a person who did not say things that did not need saying. The room was finished in May. Mabel walked through it on the morning. Calhoun declared it finished, which was not an announcement he made formally, but a fact he arrived at when he stood in the room and understood there was nothing left that needed doing. She moved through the space the way she moved through any space she was assessing, steadily, without rushing the circuit. She stood at the south window and looked out at the corral below, at Iron visible in the morning light, grazing in the near pasture beyond. She said, "You can see the corral from here." He said, "Yes." She said, "You planned that." He said, "I thought about what would be visible from a small height, looking out. I wanted the first thing visible to be something worth seeing." She stood at the window for a long moment. The morning light came through at the angle he had calculated when he was framing the wall in February, the specific gold of early Montana mornings that made everything it touched look like it had been made to be touched by it. Iron moved through that light below them with the unhurried purpose of an animal that had no unresolved business with its surroundings. She said, "You thought about small height." He said, "I thought about a number of things while I was building it. That was one." She turned from the window and looked at him with the expression that was fully hers, the one beneath all the others, the one he had been learning to recognize since the corral afternoon, as the expression she reserved for moments when the professional management of herself was not necessary, because the person in the room had already been granted access to what was underneath it. She said, "The accounting between us." He said, "What about it?" She said, "I want to tell you that it is settled, not as a concession, as a fact." He said, "I am still working on several items." She said, "I know. I am not telling you to stop. I am telling you that the ledger as I carry it has been in balance for some time. And I wanted you to know that rather than letting you continue under the impression that you are servicing a debt that from my side no longer exists." He looked at her in the morning light of the room he had built with his hands across the winter and spring months, the room that faced south and caught the early light and looked down on the corral, where Iron grazed in the near pasture, and understood that she was offering him the specific thing he had not known he needed, which was not forgiveness. He had not wronged her in the terms that required forgiveness, but release. Release from the accounting that he had been keeping with himself. The internal ledger of the September morning and its doubt and its wager, and the 6 weeks after and the gray horse and every small recalibration that had followed. He said, "I hear you." She said, "Good." He said, "I will likely continue working on it anyway. It is the kind of man I am." She said, "I know what kind of man you are." And there was in it, in the directness of it, the same thing he had been hearing across the months since September, the thing that was not quite warmth and was not quite humor, but was in the territory where those two things lived when they had been rife by someone who did not deploy either carelessly. I find I am not dissatisfied with the kind. Outside the south window the morning continued its ordinary work. Iron moved in the pasture, the valley held its light. The property ran in the rhythm it had been running in since October, the rhythm of two forms of judgment applied to the same ground, and the ground was the better for it, in ways that would continue accumulating long past the morning and the room and the conversation inside it. He did not say everything he could have said. He had learned across the winter that she did not require everything to be said, that she received what was offered and understood what was meant, and did not demand that the meant things be performed into exhaustion. This was, he had come to understand, one of the specific and considerable gifts of being with a person who paid attention as their primary mode of being in the world. Very little needed explaining. The explaining that was needed could be done plainly and briefly, and she would carry it accurately forward. He said, "I am glad the room existed to be made ready." She said, "So am I." That was the whole of it. Not the whole of everything they were building, or would encounter in the years ahead of them, on that property in that valley, with that horse in the pasture below, and whatever else was coming in the autumn and after, but the whole of what the morning required. Amos was in the yard when they came downstairs. He looked at both of them with the expressionless assessment he applied to everything and said nothing for a moment, and then said to Calhoun, "South window gets the light until about 10. Then it moves to the east side of the barn." Calhoun said, "I know." Amos said, just noting it. He went toward the barn. Calhoun watched him go with the feeling that accompanied most of Amos's departures. The sense that a great deal had just been communicated through very little, and that the great deal was accurate. Mabel stood beside him in the yard and looked toward the pasture. Iron had moved to the fence line and was standing with its head over the top rail, in the particular posture it had developed across the winter, the posture of an animal that had identified the perimeter of its territory, and was monitoring it with proprietary interest rather than anxiety. The scar caught the morning light the way it always caught, light, pale, and permanent, and no longer the first thing you noticed about the horse, if you had spent sufficient time with it. If you had spent sufficient time, the first thing you noticed was the quality of its attention, which was considerable, and which had been there, underneath the fear, all along. Calhoun looked at the horse for a moment, and then at the property, and then at the ridge beyond it carrying the last of the winter snow on its upper face, melting in the May warmth at its own pace, which was the pace of large things releasing what they had been holding. Some things he had come to understand only needed teaching once, provided the teacher with kindness. Provided the teacher was patient enough to let the lesson take the time it actually needed, and provided the student was honest enough to stop defending the position he had arrived in, and start looking at what was actually in front of him. He had been looking for 6 months now, clearly, without the instrument of his old doubt between himself and what he was seeing. What he saw was sufficient. What he saw was considerably more than sufficient. What he saw, on a May morning in the Bitterroot Valley, in the year 1884, standing in the yard of a property that was running better than it had run in 3 years, beside a woman who had arrived with one bag, and had become the most accurate reader of living things he had ever worked alongside, watching a horse that no one had believed could be reached stand at the fence line of the near pasture in the morning light, with its scar catching the sun and its attention easy and its weight distributed the way the weight of a settled thing is distributed, evenly and without reservation. Was this the shape of a life that had been rebuilt not from the outside in, but from the inside out, not by dramatic reversal but by the slower and more durable work of one honest revision at a time, until the thing being revised was no longer recognizable as the thing that had needed revising? That was not nothing. That was, in the accounting Calhoun Reed had been keeping since a September morning, when a wagon came through his gate, and a woman looked at his most difficult horse before she looked at his house, everything.